Good morning and welcome to those of you that are here with us already. We will just wait a couple of minutes just to ensure that we've got everybody that is joining us today. Again, good morning to those that are joining us. Okay, I think we will begin now. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Laura Joyner and I have recently joined the UKRO team as a European advisor, and I serve as one of the UK NCPs for the European Research Council with my colleague Dr. Antonino Puglisi. Today's presentation will focus on the ERC Synergy Grant, which is delivered by UKRO on behalf of the UK National Contact Point of the ERC. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Antonino Puglisi, who will be leading today's session. We are also delighted to be joined by ERC Synergy Grantee Professor Euan Spence, who is a Professor of Mathematics at the University of Bath. Later in the session, he will share his experience of applying for an ERC Synergy Grant. Before we begin, a quick note to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the UKRO YouTube channel shortly after the session, and we'll also post a link to the YouTube recording on the UKRO portal. Along with this, we will also post a lot of valuable resources which we'll be sharing in today's webinar. The webinar will run from 10 till 12 and it is structured in two parts. In the first part, we'll provide an overview of the ERC Synergy Grant Scheme, including key eligibility criteria and guidance on proposal development. We'll also touch briefly on the submission and evaluation processes. After a short break, we'll hand over to Professor Spence, who will talk about his personal experience with the ERC Synergy Grant application process. We'll then aim to answer as many of your questions as time allows. If you have a question during the session, please use the Q&A function in the webinar. This will be monitored throughout. However, if you could please hold off on some of your questions until after the first session, because during the first session, we will provide a lot of details. If we aren't able to respond to your queries during the session, please feel free to get in touch with us afterwards via our shared mailbox. I'll post a link with the email address shortly. A couple of housekeeping reminders for today. All participants are muted for the duration of the webinar. A recording of the webinar will be available on the UKRO portal after the session. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and you can upvote questions submitted by others. We'll prioritise the most popular during the Q&A section later. For any technical issues, please use the chat function. This is separate from the Q&A. A little bit about UKRO and how we support UK organisations involved in EU R&I funding. We are part of UKRO's wider international team, championing EU engagement. We host UK national contact points for ERC, MSCA, WIDERA, NEB and COST. We provide resources to help understand Horizon Europe on UKRO portal. And we also work in partnership with EU support teams within research organisations, helping European liaison officers navigate pre- and post-award. With that, I'll hand over to Dr. Antonino Puglisi to begin the session on striving for excellence with ERC funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for your kind introduction, and thanks already to Professor Spence for your valuable time today, sharing your journey to getting an ERC Synergy Grant. Welcome to you all. Great to see so many attendees today to our webinar. As Laura said, my name is Antonino Puglisi. Many people call me just simply by Nino, and together with Laura, I'm one of the two hubs of the UK National Contact Point for the ERC. Hope you can hear me okay. Otherwise, my colleagues will let me know, please. As Laura said, the session is being recorded. It will be available afterwards on the YouTube channel of UKRO. I'd like to start by giving a little bit of introduction, background really about the funding scheme itself for those of you who are not overly familiar with this Horizon Europe opportunity. In a nutshell, the European Research Council funds frontier research, offering long-term grants for scientists and scholars conducting pioneering research projects in any field of research. The sole criterion for such grants is scientific excellence, no more, no less. And you will hear this pretty much like a mantra throughout our presentation today. Some facts and figures around the ERC. Since its inception in 2007, it has funded 13,000 top researchers from all over the world, more than 90 different nationalities. The project funded by the ERC have produced more than 250,000 publications. More than 2,400 patents have come out of ERC grants, and over 400 startups have emerged somehow as a consequence of ERC-funded projects. Among its grantees, the ERC counts several Nobel Prize winners and other recipients of highly prestigious international awards. To achieve that, the scheme has a budget of over 16 billion euros, which ran for a period from 2021 to 2027. That is around 17% of the overall budget of Horizon Europe, with the ERC getting proportionally the most amount of money as of any other dimension of Horizon Europe. So as I can imagine, an incredibly popular and attractive scheme, but as you know, also, and as you can imagine, also an incredibly competitive one. The funding scheme itself is open to individual researchers from all over the world, regardless of their nationality, age, gender, and we will delve into eligibility details in a moment. However, your host institution has to be established in one of the EU member states or an associate country to Horizon Europe, like the UK is now. You and your team do not have to work full-time in Europe. There are conditions around that, which we'll go through in the eligibility section. But I would like to anticipate already that for Synergy Grant, there is something very special, that maximum one participant, one PI, that is out of the four, can remain based outside EU member states and associate countries. But we will go back to that when it comes to eligibility criteria. In the ERC grants, your research can cover any field of research, and there is no thematic restrictions. Is very much a bottom-up approach to the themes chosen by the researchers. There is no need to form a consortium as such. There are team members though, and I will describe that in a moment. And there is no need for co-financing like in other opportunities in Horizon Europe. Just convince the ERC about the scientific excellence of both yourself as the principal investigator, as a pool of principal investigators in this case, and your ambitious pioneering research proposal. In the ERC family, there are 4+1 options in terms of funding opportunities, and each one is calibrated on the level of seniority of the applicant, if you want. They mostly run up to 5 years, with the exception of Synergy, that we will see runs up to 6 years. And we will briefly touch on each of the options before delving onto the Synergy. In the starting grant, you receive up to 1.5 million euros, and that's for applicants who got the PhD between 2 to 7 years ago. Consolidator is a grant of up to 2 million euros, and you obtain your PhD between 7 to 12 years ago. The advanced grant, we just ran a few weeks ago a dedicated webinar on that, supports outstanding established research leaders, and that is a grant of up to 2.5 million. And technically, there are no requirements around PhD. Then the Synergy grant is the largest of all. It's up to 10 million euros, together with up to 4 researchers you tackle a scientific problem so ambitious that it could not be addressed by an individual researcher by themselves or their teams working alone. We'll dedicate this webinar exclusively to the synergy, but I'd like already to highlight some distinctive features, if you want, of this scheme. As I've mentioned, it ran up to 6 years, like the others, which are only 5. One of the host institutions can be based and remain based outside Europe. And your proposal is evaluated with an additional step, but I will explain all of that in terms now. Then at the bottom, you can see is another option called the proof of concept. Now, if you are in possession of any of the above 4, you can apply for a lump sum of money, which is 150,000 euros, to support ERC grantees, bridging the gap between their research idea and the potential social and commercial exploitation. Now, some of you might have heard that there are changes on the horizon in terms of eligibility window that I just described, the 2 to 7 and the 7 to 12. Now, those changes will apply only to the 2027 work program. So for the sake of keeping this to the point, I'm not going to touch on that change of eligibility criteria for eligibility window for 2027. However, if you're curious about discovering more about what is on the horizon, I would recommend you to check the webinar that the ERC has produced on the 10th of June, and Laura is going to put that link in the chat. What is very important for this webinar is to highlight that the Synergy already inaugurates, if you want, a new proposal structure and some also changes in the resubmission restriction, particularly for the Synergy grant. So I will go into that into a moment. National Contact Point Office, we run dedicated webinars on each of the upcoming calls, and you can already find registration to the registration link in the chat for the upcoming starting grant, which is only the day after tomorrow, and the consolidated grant for 2026, which is happening on the 23rd of September. Now back to the specifics of the ERC Synergy. The stated mission of the Synergy grant is to support researchers who want to address a research problem so ambitious that cannot be dealt with you as a PI individually or your team working alone. The Synergy grant is a grant of up to 10 million euros and is awarded to a group of 2 to 4 maximum principal investigators working together and bringing different skills and resources to tackle an ambitious research project. Proposals are evaluated on the sole criterion of scientific excellence, which takes an additional meaning with the synergy of an outstanding, also intrinsic synergistic effect. And technically, you don't need to evidence a PhD, just like in the advanced grant. What is special about the Synergy grant? Well, there are a number of things that make the ERC Synergy grant unique. First of all, it's a joint effort of a pool of 2 to 4 principal investigators, but there is also but there is no specific hierarchy within the team. Each PI has equal status in the group, and each of them providing complementary and synergistic expertise. When we talk about synergy, we're talking about the necessity of those individuals to work together in a coherent project with the aim and objectives where a single individual wouldn't be able to deliver on their own. This means that losing one of those PIs makes the whole project, in a way, fall apart. So something to be aware that once you decide your team of 4 PIs, up to 4 PIs, you really need to stick to it until the very end of the project. There's no way to replace a PI. A word about the corresponding PI. As mentioned, in the Synergy, there is a group of 2 to 4 PIs, but one of these principal investigators is designated in what we call a corresponding PI. They are effectively the interface between the project and the European Commission. The corresponding PI bears the overall administrative responsibility for the implementation of the project. Generally speaking, What that means is that if there is any sort of conflict within the team, they are responsible for resolving any possible problem there, and they are also responsible for preparing the financial and scientific reports when it comes to that reporting period. But the corresponding PI is not the team leader, and there's no other specific role within the project other than that administrative sort of responsibility. One really crucial thing to bear in mind is the Commission now allows for one of those PIs, maximum one, to be based outside the EU member state or social countries. But that particular PI cannot be the corresponding PI. Still talking about the group, another thing to bear in mind is that PIs participating, that team of the pool of 4 PIs, can be a mix of different career stages, and that at the evaluation stage, each individual PI will be evaluated on their own and eventually also as a group. Now, something that everyone is very interested in, funding rates. To achieve that vision, the ERC funds up to 10 million euros, known as the base amount for the Synergy Grant over a period of 6 years. Now, all the ERC options that I've described come with the possibility of top-up money for specific purposes, which are captured in the orange box, and those are startup costs, purchase of major equipment, access to large facilities, and other major experimental and fieldwork costs. So that applies to all ERC options. Now, as before, researchers already working in the European Union or associated country to Horizon Europe can apply for up to 1 billion per PI for such additional funding. But what is new with this call with 2026 is that now researchers moving to Europe from outside the European Union or associated country to Horizon Europe can now apply for double that amount of money. That is, can apply to up to 2 million in additional funding per PI. Okay, so that's one major change already for the 2026 work program. Those coming from outside Europe will be competing on exactly the same terms as other applicants. Scientific excellence remains the only criterion of evaluation, and there are no quotas between those coming from within Europe and those coming from outside Europe. Sorry, and also very important, you can now include personnel costs within the additional either 2 million if you come from outside Europe or 1 million if you come from within Europe or social country. That wasn't allowed until the 2025 work program. As always, applicants are requested to define and justify the needs for those additional funding in the proposal. The decision to award the requested funding rests, of course, with the evaluation panel. So we get a lot of questions about how to frame, how to best sell additional funding. So bottom line is that evaluators will assess the necessity of those additional funding in the context of the overall project. So our advice is to include essential items in your base amount, but it's ultimately up to your capacity to articulate and persuade the reviewers about the need for additional funding. Now, going back to the specific of the Synergy Grant, the call opened on the 10th of July, just a couple of weeks ago, and we closed on the 5th of November 2025. That is at 5 p.m. in Brussels time, so Central European time, not British time. Something to note here is that the calendar doesn't give you a huge amount of time putting together your proposal last minute. So that is to emphasize that ERC proposals, and particularly the Synergy Grant, because of the complexity, do not lend themselves to last-minute speculative application. Also, and here comes also some novelty with the 2026 work program, there are a bit more stringent resubmission restrictions now, which I will describe later in my presentation. But essentially, if you don't score particularly high in the evaluation, you will be stopped from resubmitting for a time. But we will see that towards the end. of the presentation. So our advice is to be strategic as to when to apply, so that your proposal meets the criteria of particularly the criterion of excellence, which underpins the evaluation of the ERC Synergy Grant. Particularly with the Synergy, where you don't have an eligibility window. Just to remind people to not to evidence the PhD, you can afford, if you want to be more strategic as to when to apply. Then if you have a look at the third bubble in red, you can see that there are 3 dates in there. That's because the ERC Synergy is a single submission, but 3-step evaluation process. And I will go into that throughout my presentation again. But just be aware that this is sort of the timeline that you can expect. That also, in terms of managing your expectations from the 10th of July 2025, when the call opens, if you are successful throughout, you're expected to sign your grant agreement only in March 2027. It's a very long time. It's nearly 2 years. Just to make you aware of the long process that is involved in the for the evaluation of the Synergy Grant. Now, the budget for this year, for the 2026 work program, allocated for the Synergy Grant is 500 million euros. And the number of grants which is anticipated to be funded with this money is about 49 grants. I hope that was comprehensive enough in terms of a high-level presentation of ERC options and the Synergy Grant in particular. I'm going to focus now on the eligibility window. And for the ERC, that's in a way rather simple. In terms of eligibility of the principal investigator, that's you, the applicant, it's important to underline that there are no restrictions in terms of age, nationality, current location, current employment. A lot of people ask us whether they need to have a permanent position. They don't. Your contract status is not really a criteria of evaluation for the principal investigator. What is really important is your groundbreaking idea. As I said, you must also have a host institution based in the EU member state or associate country willing to host you. And now the UK, from 1st of January 2024, is an associated country to Horizon Europe, so you're absolutely free to apply. Also, just a reminder, in the ERC Synergy, once again, we have this unique feature that maximum of 1 PI can be or remain based anywhere else in the world, even in countries that are not associated to Horizon Europe. There are also demands in terms of your time commitment to the grants. In the Synergy, there is a minimum of 30% of your working time on the grant. But also you need to spend a minimum of 50% of your time based in a member state or associate country. Now note that that percentage is calculated as an average across the entire project duration. And also it's good to know that if you do a lot of field work that takes you outside the European Union or the associated country, like the UK, that time does not count as time spent outside Europe. It does still count as time spent in your time in Europe. And finally, in terms of eligibility, as mentioned, PhD is not a requirement in the ERC Synergy, so there is no eligibility window as such. Regarding the host institution, it can be any legal entity. In a majority of cases, it would be universities or research institutions, but it can be also business, public bodies, NGOs. It just needs to be a registered legal entity in the country where you apply. Your host institution, again, needs to be based in a member state or associate country to Horizon Europe. Apart from that, 1 PI can be outside that area. The host institution needs to have the infrastructure and capacity to allow the PI to independently carry out the research. And crucially, the host institution must not constrain the PI to institutional research strategy. Crucially, if the PI is not happy with the arrangements, the principal investigator has the right to transfer the grant to another institution. And very important, the host institution is not assessed in the evaluation process. So in general terms, the principal investigator must be engaged for the project duration and that is formalized by a letter of commitment signed by the host institution, which is submitted as part of the application. And now about team members. Now, you don't have to have team members, but for most grants, you have other researchers providing scientific additional intellectual value, if you want, to your project. But what is really important for this type of grant is that the PI must remain central to the project. Additional team members may also be hosted by institutions established anywhere in the world, including outside European Union or associated countries to Horizon Europe. However, the PI should at all times, and it's very, very important, really be seen as the lead person, the sole person driving the research project. In other words, the PI should not have equal within the team other than the other PIs, okay? The PI has the freedom to choose the team members, and those team members can be at any level of seniority who can be included in the project. But of course, as for anything in Horizon Europe, you need to explain, well, to budget, justify, explain why you're choosing those individuals and what they will be doing in the project. At the proposal stage, you can name individuals in your team members if you have a specific person in mind. If you don't, then you need to go through afterwards through a fair and transparent recruitment process. Also for team members, like for PIs, there are no restrictions in terms of age, nationality, or country of residence. And also to emphasize that for team members, those individuals can be based anywhere in the world. That's a unique feature of the ERC in Horizon Europe. So to recap, as you can see, Synergy grants are very flexible in composition. You can have, in fact, a very well calibrated team according to the implementation of the project of this sort. In terms of the PI, you can have between 2 to 4 PIs. They can be based in one host organization, or they can be spread across 4 different organizations. That doesn't really matter for the ERC. They can be at any level of seniority, as we said. They can be as close as being in the same corridor, in the same department, so long as you can evidence interdisciplinarity or synergy, if you want, in that proposal. Or they can be at the opposite ends of the world. That doesn't really matter in terms of eligibility. In terms of team members, each of those PI can have, each one of them, different team members. There are no criteria in terms of the seniority of people working for you as team members. So a lot of flexibility also inbuilt in the way you organize your own team. Right, now to the development of your own proposal. In the ERC, your proposal is broken down essentially in 3 parts. A part A, a B1, a B2, and then you got transversal, if you want, an horizontal dimension, which is that of the annexes. Okay. So part A is the administrative part, and is completely online. You do that on the funding and tenders portal. B1 and B2 have templates that you download for the funding and tender portals, fill them out, and then you PDF them and re-upload in the submission environment in the funding and tender portal. And then you have the opportunity to upload other supporting documents as annexes, and these are typically your letter of support from your host institution. If you have any supporting documents for your ethics and security section, which we will go through in a moment. And now I will focus on each of these dimensions in turn. So part A, that again is the online part. That's what it looks like in the funding and then the portal, and it's made up of different parts. So we got the general information. In general information, you give details such as the title of your project, the acronym, the duration of the project. Remember, it's up to 6 years. Doesn't have to be 6 years. The abstract, and very important, you give 4 keywords which will guide the evaluation process. Here is also where you say whether your proposal is a resubmission. You should reply yes, even if you're resubmitting a completely different proposal, but with the same name. So the resubmission restrictions apply to the PI, not to the project as such. One other thing you'll be asked in section A, general information, is whether you got the consent of all people involved in your proposal. There is no specific documents you should have on file. Sometimes even a simple email suffices, so long as you can evidence that you have had the consent of all the team members involved. In part A, you give details about the participants, and that is the list of team members, if you have any, the PIs, that's yourself and your pool of PIs. Each individual must be encoded according to the host institution or beneficiary they are affiliated with. And that's something very important to understand. In the ERC, each one, that is each PI and each team member, will receive funding directly from the European Commission through their own host institution. So there is not a coordinator like in collaborative projects disbursing money to the team members. So each either team member or principal investigator will receive money directly through their own host institution. Now, budget. In the ERC Synergy, the budget is done in a slightly different way in comparison to starting and consolidator, as it comes effectively presented twice. So once by host institution, and that's what we're seeing now in the slide in part A, once by principal investigator, and we will see that when it comes to part B2. So here, for instance, I've encoded two beneficiaries, one be UKRO, the other one be my alma mater, University of Catania in Italy. So if you have more participants, and there can be more PIs, of course, or more team members in the same host institution, they are all bundled up, if you want, under the same role, because that is essentially the way you present budget in part A when it comes to presenting budget by host institution, by beneficiary. These figures in the administrative section, of course, must be corresponding then to the budget that you will present again in part B2, where you give details about how each team member is going to work under each PI. In part A, you give information about also your ethics and security self-assessment, and Laura very kindly will put the link to the guide on how to complete your ethics self-assessment in the chat. But essentially, you'll be asked to identify any particular ethics and security issue in your project. And if you reply yes, you need to give a short explanation. In some cases, provide, if it's a very serious and major ethical issue, to upload ethical clearance from your national sort of regulation or a European, in according to European and national laws. There is a dedicated document, as I mentioned, that Laura is put up in the chat, so you can find detailed information in there. Finally, you got another other question section in part A. And here you indicate who is your corresponding PI. We have already described that. You give details again of your pool of principal investigators, but crucially, you give information about your working commitment to work in the European Union or associated country. And that commitment is 50% to work in the European Union or associated countries. Okay, so this the administrative part, also known as part A. Let's now delve into the scientific proposal itself. As mentioned, your scientific proposal is composed of two parts, and you will need to give information on your proposal through two different templates, asking slightly different things if you want. Your B1 comprises the part 1 of your scientific proposal, plus CV track record for each PI, whereas B2 contains essentially the part 2 of your scientific proposal, plus a more detailed resources and time commitment explanation. Let me remind you that everything, part B1, part B2 must be submitted by deadline. So it's not that you submit first part B1 and then part B2 as step 2. You submit everything by deadline, and then they will be evaluated at 2 different steps. Your scientific proposal is effectively broken down into bits which are complementary to each other, like 2 pieces of a puzzle, if you want, and they correspond and they respond to different questions about your project. So in part 1, formerly known as extended synopsis, so the jargon has slightly changed, but the essence is, in this case, is pretty much the same. The overall idea of the proposed research proposal includes the current state of the art and how the research will contribute to the field, and therefore your scientific question must be very clear. You should also set clearly your objectives and give a sense of the overall approach of your research strategy. As in the past, the length of this section would be 5 pages. So if you think about it, there's a lot of questions to answer here in only 5 pages, so you need to be succinct and to the point. Again, on part 1, must be self-contained. It is essentially a stand-alone document. Just to remind you, this is all that the reviewers will see as step 1 evaluation. Also, you should be ambitious and demonstrate that this is not an incremental research that you are doing. Specific for Synergy, it must contain all the relevant information about the combination of different expertise of your team. In other words, you should give a sense of why we need this particular set of PIs working together rather than conducting their own research, and how you as a team synergize and complement each other in what you are planning to achieve. It must be persuasive to a generalist audience. We'll go into that in a moment, but basically try to provoke as much as possible a step 1, so in part 1, heavy jargon. Try to convey what excites you about your scientific project. Consider also to the scientific impact you're gonna have, not just a deadline, but throughout the six years, and why a group-based approach is needed for this particular project. Talk about, of course, the timeliness, why it's urgent, and the relevance, why you're deciding to apply now. So that's all about the part 1. Part 2, and here some major changes coming to play. You should focus primarily on the implementation in details. You'll be asked to include details about your research methodology, your work plan, your risk assessment and mitigation measures, and justify the requested budget and resources. Now, the major change here is that the length of this section now is be shortened to 10 pages for Synergy Grant application. It used to be 15 pages, so this is a significant decrease of the number of pages. You should explain also the collaborative arrangements enabling the Synergy Grant carrying out the project. So what is essentially changing here in comparison to previous year is you don't reframe in the state of the art again. Yeah, so the state of the art is defined already in part 1, which will be assessed as step 1. In part 2, the focus is primarily now on implementation. That's why it's a lot shorter than it used to be. So I hope that gives you the idea about how to develop your proposal. Some overarching suggestion here. So you download your templates B1 and B2 from the funding and the portal. I will show you in a moment how to get but please pay close attention to the formatting requirements. Avoid putting off your researches by using too small of a font, for instance. Stick to the requirements that would be very clearly stated in the template, and also, as Laura has already put in the chat, stick to the information for applicant, which is a very detailed document. Obviously, keep to the page limit. So just to remind you, 5 pages for part 1, 10 pages for part 2. Everything beyond this limit will not be considered. References do not count towards page limits. And as I said, keep on hand information for applicants, which is a very, very important and detailed and clear document. So to recap the essential elements of your application, Part A is everything online, is your administrative part. B1 and B2 requires templates you can download from the funding and the portal. You fill them out, upload as PDF. And this is where you source your templates within the submission service environment, where you find the number one. That's the place where you can download your templates as a zip folder. And then that contains your B1, your B2, your host institution letter, and this Excel spreadsheet, which I will describe in a moment when it comes to the details of Part 2 for the budget. Right, so B1, that's all that the reviewers will see as step 1 evaluation. So it better look good. It's pretty much your business card. It's not that the reviewers will, it's all that the reviewers will see as step 1 evaluation. It comprises of your Part 1, which I've already described in your research, a cover page, which essentially extracts information from your Part A, but also a CV and track record for each of the up to 4 principal investigators. And that CV and track record is now bundled up into one single document of up to 4 pages. Remember, CV and track record is 4 pages per PI. So the first thing to say about CV and track record is that the ERC doesn't have a very prescriptive format. So you can, of course, use a standard CV as they use in Continental Europe, or you can have a more narrative sort of a CV. That's absolutely fine. Consider to highlight everything which is relevant in your field, but also that ties in very well with your proposal narrative. In other words, sorry. In other words, your best and most cited 10 publication might not always be the best way to evidence that you are the best place, in the best place or the best person really to implement a particular project. Also very important to emphasize, if you've got any career breaks or any unconventional career path, try to explain, so the ERC tries to be very broad-minded when it comes to assessing, let's say, PI's track record. So do not think that if you got an unusual career path, you are not necessarily suited for the ERC. So long as you can explain, and of course you can evidence you're the best person still to implement your research project. Okay, B2 is what the reviewers will see if you pass step 1, together again with your B1. Here, the overall emphasis, as I mentioned, is on the implementation. You should include details of your research proposal, as well as the budget and the time commitment of all the individuals involved, or the PIs involved. All this essentially is done in 2 ways. So you got your full detailed proposal, your Part 2, which, as I said, is 10 pages now, which I abundantly explained, I hope by now. And then you got a section on resources and time commitment, which I will explain in a moment. And third, you got this funding ID. So funding ID is essentially there to give the Commission a sense of your workload. It's not there just to show off about how many grants you got going at the moment, how many grants you've got in the past. It's just to give them a sense that you can really fulfill the minimum time commitment to the grant that you have already expressed in your Part A. So you should really list in funding ID all your ongoing grants and also your all your grants you applied for. Your resource and time commitment and your funding ID do not count towards the 10 pages limits that is instead only applying to your Part 2. Resources and time commitment, you have a narrative part, which is in your B2 template, and a separate Excel file, which I've briefly showed you just a minute ago. In the narrative part, this is your what is called the section C of your template B2. You describe and fully justify the amount of funding requested for each PI. So if you remember, there was a budget in part A by host institution or beneficiary. Now is the part of the budget in which you explain the amount requested for PI by PI. So you spend the amount of money that is considered necessary for fulfilling the objectives throughout the duration of the project. And as for everything Horizon Europe, you need to duly justify the estimated cost for each cost category. As I mentioned, there is an Excel template that you will need to download and fill out. Here in the resource and time commitment is also where you define your minimum time commitment to the grant. So in the ERC, you got a minimum 30% of time commitment to the grant, which is a separate eligibility to the minimum 50% to be in the European Union or associated country to Horizon Europe. So you will need eventually to upload the B1, B2, the host letter, those institutions supporting letter, and this Excel template duly filled out. The annex containing the budget table and the time commitment would be made available to reviewers at step 2 and 3. Now, ensure that your narrative description in part B2, section C, is consistent with the budget that you have already outlined in your part A by beneficiary. Okay, so here just to emphasize again, your in Excel table, once again, you give your time commitment 30%, and also you request additional funding if you request those top-up money. And here again is where you source your Excel template, downloading the zip folder from the submission service in here, and then you see all the 4 templates which are necessary for your submission. Here again is the narrative part, which I've just described in a moment, and all your classic presentation if you want, or your all the budget categories. Submission process, very briefly. So if you haven't already, it is absolutely essential that you register as an individual in the funding and tender portal by creating what is called an ECAS account. When you do so, you give information about your affiliation, your host institution, you're submitting your proposal with, yeah? If you're changing host institution, you should indicate your new host institution already. It is important that you also reach out to your research support office within that organization, not only because they will be notified when you initiate your application with them, but also because often you will be able to find support for your administrative journey to submission. And then once you are in the submission environment, you add all the relevant contact details and other people within the organization. You might want to contribute to give those editing rights to other people within the organization, just to go cover in case people are sick leave or being on annual leave. And then you can submit as early as you want by clicking the submit button, which effectively acts as a save as button. So only the latest saved application will be collected by the European Commission at deadline. So do not be afraid of clicking that submit button throughout your the time you're preparing your application. So this is what the funding and tenders portal will look like after you log in. So first of all, you choose your call. Make sure that you choose the right call. In this case, it's Synergy 2026. Then the edit form, which is the second orange box, that's where you access your part A, which I've already explained earlier in my presentation. That's where you download your templates for the 2 part Bs, if you want, the host institution letter and the Excel table. And here is where you re-upload all your filled out documents, which have been converted into PDF. And as I mentioned, this bin button, you can click as many times as you want, and everything will be collected only at that line. And finally, you will see on the left-hand side, there is an IT sort of support on the left-hand corner to help you, but that helps you only for any technical, let's say, question with the portal, not with the application per se, of course. Evaluation process. So Synergy evaluation works in a slightly different way. So if you already are familiar with starting concerns in advance, this is something you really need to readjust because we got an extra step in comparison to the other ERC Frontier grant. As mentioned again, there's a single submission, so everything must go through by deadline, followed by a 3-step evaluation, which includes for the ERC Synergy an in-person interview in Brussels, step 3. Then you don't need to submit. The very different thing with the ERC Synergy is that you don't need to submit your proposal to one specific panel, unlike the ERC other frontier, ERC Frontier grants, which are split into the 3 classic broad thematic areas, and I will go into that in a moment. Now, due to the collaborative nature of Synergy Grant, the evaluation process doesn't have a disciplinary panel, as I mentioned. Instead, there are bespoke panels with a variety of experts set up during the evaluation to match the unique profile submitted by the proposers. But let's take one step at a time here. So at step 1, applicants apply to a single large panel, with a lot of panel members covering all possible fields of science and scholarship. At this step, part 1 of your scientific proposal and the principal investigator's CV and track record will be assessed by that large panel. To facilitate the allocation of the proposal to the right experts, the corresponding PI, as indicated already in part A, as I've already outlined, up to 4, minimum 4, from 4 to 6 actually fixed keywords. So there must be minimum 4 up to 6 fixed keywords. So the panel chairs will find the most relevant expert within that large panel to evaluate that proposal. It is the corresponding PI who has the responsibility to choose the and indicate the most relevant keywords. Now, after remote evaluation phase, in which each proposal is reviewed by a minimum of 3 reviewers, the panel chair selects those proposals passing to step 2. What is really new, and a lot of people ask us, is that feasibility is no longer addressed as step 1 evaluation. So you should really focus on convincing the panel member that you're pushing the frontier of knowledge in that particular area of scholarship. Briefly on step 2, at this step, the complete research proposal. At step 2, the complete research proposal will be assessed. That is your CV and track record, then part 1, and part B2 and part B2, resources and time commitment and budget annexes. So everything will be now put together in front of your evaluators. The composition of the panel step 2 is by nature multidisciplinary to accommodate a proper evaluation given the complexity of such proposal. And this is done by grouping proposal based on the research areas to match with the expertise of the panel members. At this stage, external specialized reviewers, and those are the guys with a star, will be brought in to complement the reviewers in the 5 to 7 panels that have been formed. Each panel will have around 15 experts each, and remain highly multidisciplinary to respect the highly complex nature of Synergy Grant, but will be more oriented towards the 3 classic domains for the ERC: physical sciences, life sciences, social sciences, humanities. Proposal will be retained for step 3 based on the outcome of the evaluation at step 2, and of course also based on predefined budgetary cutoff levels. Something to be aware of at this stage is that the names of the panel chairs will be made available before the call deadline, whereas the names of the panel members will be published only after the call deadline and before step 1 evaluation. This is something that has been introduced only very recently, but it is a good time as those names now start to circulate and become available, just to remind people that under no circumstances applicants should contact peer reviewers. Any attempt to do so would be considered breach of research integrity, and it might result in rejection of the proposal. Finally, on step 3, if you made it so far, well done you. You receive an invitation and with a letter detailing the format and the length of your in-person interview in Brussels. The ERC has recently produced material that you can find in the ERC classes that Laura is going to put in the chat in a moment. Panel member at this stage will reassess everything again, so part 1, part 2, budget, table annexes, based on the evaluation they got on step 2 reports, and prepare questions for the interview. The interview typically lasts up to 45 minutes, in total, but the panel might ask you, the applicant, to give only between 7 to 15 minutes presentation to describe your proposed research project. And it would be very interesting to hear from Professor Spence how he got around that. The remaining time is all about, answering questions and explaining the modalities of collaboration between the principal investigators. Interviews are expected to take place between the 7th to the 11th of September 2026. What is the evaluation based on? Excellence, of course, remains the sole criterion of evaluation, but that is intended both in terms of the excellence of you as the PI, or as the pool of PI, and that of the research project. Therefore, at each evaluation step, the reviewers will primarily evaluate the quality of the research proposal and the groundbreaking nature of your proposal, and of course the synergistic aspect and the ambition of the research project. Also, the intellectual capacity of the PI and the creativity will be assessed. And that very strange pizza tower in the middle of the slide is there to indicate that the ERC seems to have a slight preference to lean towards the excellence of the research project rather than the excellence of the principal investigator. That's to emphasize that the ERC doesn't like to reward people just because they got lots of grants in the past, but it's all about the excellence of the idea that you got. But in terms of evaluation criteria, you can read all this in your information for applicant, but very, very briefly, you should ask yourself, does the research address an important scientific question? That's very important. Are the project objectives ambitious, and they indicate that you're pushing the frontier of knowledge? And does the proposal go beyond what the individual principal investigator could achieve on their own? That's for what the research project is concerned, but also describing in detail, is the research methodology and working regimen appropriate to achieve the goal of the project? The timescale is adequate, and the combination of expertise of the principal investigator is appropriate really to tackle the complexity of the research questions to be tackled. Whereas for the principal investigator, you should demonstrate the ability to conduct groundbreaking research, provide evidence of creative original thinking, and of course, for synergy, demonstrate that you bring together the know-how necessary to address the proposed research questions. Finally, on resubmission restrictions, and here we come with some news with the 2026 work program. Basically, rules are a bit stricter from now on. If you obtained, for those of you who have already applied to 2025 Synergy Grant, if you obtained a score B, a step 1, unfortunately, you cannot resubmit to this upcoming call in 2026. It didn't used to be the case. If you score B, there were no resubmission restriction. Now with the 2026 work program, there are. So I repeat, if you obtain a score B, a step 1 for the 2025, you cannot resubmit to 2026, the upcoming call. But in essence, you need to score an A throughout the first and the second step. And then if you score 2 A's in a row, you go to interview in Brussels. And then if you're recommended for funding, if sufficient funding available, then you made it. Please note that if a proposal is resubmitted, reviewers won't have access to previous ERC proposals, not to the earlier evaluation report. So in essence, if you score a B, C, you are now stopped for a year or 2 years at step 1. If you got a B at step 2, no resubmission restriction. If you score a B at step 3, again, no resubmission restriction. So resubmission applies only at step 1, 1 year for B, 2 years for C. Other points to consider very briefly: Open Science. Horizon Europe is in Horizon Europe is a requirement all over to use Open Science principle. Just be mindful of that, you can find details in the slides. The European Commission has set up a specific platform called Open Research Europe, which at the moment is delivered by F1000 and support Horizon 2020 Horizon Europe beneficiary to publish all articles for free. Another particular aspect to be mindful of is sex and gender. There is dedicated material on this. You can find, again, it's a corporate feature of everything Horizon Europe. You can find it pretty much everywhere. Some useful links, resources. Laura's been busy putting those in the chat, but just to recap, the ERC website is a great source of information. Also, they are recently launched a YouTube channel containing ERC classes, which have been redone, and they're very comprehensive. Of course, the ERC work program, very, very important. That should be one of your sort of reference documents for while you prepare your application. And as we said many times, also, of course, the information for applicant to help you navigate the submission process. You will find a link to the call for proposal itself. And if you're curious about everything legal and financial, also model grant agreement is hyperlinked, and you should look at Annex 5 in particular. And very finally, our contact details. If you're not already familiar, that email address where Laura and I would be busy answering your queries. Also, you can subscribe to our regular newsletter through the QR code. And from me now, it remains only to wish you the best of luck with your frontier research proposal. And we look forward to being in touch with you for any further support we can offer. And with this, I'm gonna take a break for about 10 minutes. So we will reconvene at 11:15 to hear from Professor Spence. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had the chance to stretch your leg and grab a coffee. My colleagues and I have been busy answering some of your queries, but presumably we will have time towards the end to answer live more. I'd like to invite Professor Spence to turn on his camera. There we are. Thank you, Professor Spence, for joining us again today. We're going to give you the floor now to share your experience with getting an ERC Synergy. We look forward to your words.
Great. Thank you, Antonino. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so my name is Euan Spence. I'm a professor of mathematics at the University of Bath, and I'm a corresponding PI of an ERC Synergy Grant that was awarded in the last round. Excuse me. So last September, we found out we got it. And I've been asked today to share a little bit about my experiences. So in a minute, I'm going to show you a few slides on the research in the grant. Don't worry, these are non-technical. I've taken them actually from the presentation that we gave at interview. And after those few slides, I was going to have just a few reflections from having gone through the process. So of course, there's a disclaimer that the scope of the ERC Synergy Grant, as we've heard in the first hour, is very wide in terms of research areas, and lots of different people have done lots of different experiences. But I focused on the experiences that we had that I think are the most sort of widely applicable. Right. So with that disclaimer, let me share my slides. So you should be able to see now. Okay, so the title of this our project was Phase Space Inspired Numerical Methods for High Frequency Scattering. Sounds very scary. It's in the general area of computational mathematics, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And so there were 3 PIs. So there's myself, Euan Spence at the University of Bath. Like I said, I'm the corresponding PI. So, and as we heard in the first hour, that doesn't mean that I'm the leader, but it means I get to fill in all the online forms. And then Jeff Galkowski is also a professor of mathematics at the University College London. So Jeff is a pure mathematician. I'm an applied mathematician. And then Pierre-Henri Tournier in the CNRS in Paris. He's based in Sorbonne University. He's an expert in scientific computing. So the expertise was sort of pure maths, applied maths, scientific computing. So one thing I wanted to say because there are some questions on it is each of our 3 teams, we all had team members under us. Some of them were named as in team member specific person. Some of them were just said research associate that we're going to hire. The CNRS team had people in that team who weren't at CNRS. So then their institutions were added as partners. I think the technical term was associated entity in the form. And that sort of, some people were asking questions on that. So of course there's a little slight complication, but it works out okay in the form, adding team members who are not part of so in this case CNRS. Right, so let me tell you a little bit about the research in this Synergy Grant. So the scientific challenge is that there's a plethora of everyday technologies that involve acoustic and electromagnetic waves. So here in this talk, we said, well, there's telecommunications involving mobile phones, Wi-Fi, these involving electromagnetic waves. There's medical imaging, ultrasound. In fact, this is Jeff's now 3-year-old daughter, but when she was had a scan when she was before she was born, this is her. And then weather forecasting uses radar. That's also using electromagnetic waves. And in fact, I'm talking to you now thanks to both acoustic waves. So my vocal cords are creating acoustic waves. They're being picked up by my computer's microphone. It's being transformed into electromagnetic waves. That information is then going via the internet, Wi-Fi to your computer, and you are then hearing me. So again, we're all used to using these communications and imaging technologies based on acoustic and electromagnetic waves. Now, the challenge is that actually designing accurate, fast, and reliable algorithms for computing high-frequency waves is a long-standing open problem in computational mathematics. And that's this problem that our Synergy Grant seeks to address. So who's working on this problem? Well, there's people in the numerical analysis community. So this is mathematicians interested in computing high frequency waves. Then there are people in scientific computing. So the other PI, Pierre-Henri Tournier, is an expert in scientific computing. He's interested in high frequency waves. Of course, then there's engineers, and all the way to people working actually in these industrial applications on high frequency waves. And these disciplines are kind of connected together via this computational waves community, where there's a free flow of exchange of ideas and information between these different disciplines. Now, it turns out there's another group of researchers interested in high frequency waves, and they're pure mathematicians in this area called semi-classical analysis. So the adjective semi-classical essentially means high frequency. And perhaps surprisingly, sort of almost none of the insights, deep theoretical insights about high frequency waves from this area of semi-classical analysis and pure maths were being used to actually compute these waves in practice. And so for the last between 10 and 15 years, in fact, I have been trying to learn about, so I'm coming from numerical analysis, I'm trying to learn about semi-classical analysis and use these semi-classical analysis techniques to understand existing numerical methods for solving high frequency waves. And that's been a collaboration with Jeff. So I'm sitting here in numerical analysis. I was been collaborating with Jeff Galkowski, one of the other PIs, for the last 10 plus years in using semi-classical analysis to understand existing numerical methods. But the goal of this SINUM-SCAT project is to then inextricably combine these deep insights from pure mathematics on high frequency waves in the design, analysis, and implementation of numerical methods. So there's myself in numerical analysis, there was Jeff in semi-classical analysis, Pierre-Henri Tournier in scientific computing, and the plan of the SINUM-SCAT is then to bring these three areas together to solve this long-standing open problem, with the end goal, we hope at the end of the 6 years, that semi-classical analysis has been brought into the computational waves community, and that the deep insights from pure mathematics on high frequency waves are now being used all the way to industrial applications of these waves. Right. So that's what I was going to say about this. That was our pitch about the science. And so again, I think it was, again, on reflection, the fact that Jeff and I had this track record of working together was kind of a benefit to the proposal. And also then Pierre-Henri and I, we had written one paper together almost 10 years ago. So we had some track record working together. So we had this. So this was a sort of foundation on which the project was built. But of course, it was very important that we demonstrated we were doing something that was a step change above the existing things we'd done. Right. So that's, again, all I wanted to say about the research, but that gives you an idea of the story, as it were, of our proposal. Then some reflections afterwards. Okay, so perhaps the most useful thing we did in preparation was we tracked down, we looked at the list of funded projects, and we talked to people who had a project funded recently in the sort of, again, not obviously in our area, but in our specific area, but in computational mathematics. So we didn't know these people, but we knew sort of people who they were sort of friends of friends or colleagues of colleagues, and we got in touch with them and talked to them. This was tremendously helpful to hear about their experiences. Although, again, still our experiences were a little bit different. I mean, I think that the way they described the interview to us was a bit like a sort of brutal fight to the death, whereas we came out of the interview slightly less traumatized, or with a slightly different experience. So again, I mentioned that just to say there will be a wide variety of experiences. The interview, our impression really was that the panel, a collection of smart people, were really just trying to understand our proposed research. And of course, it was a stressful experience, but it was quite fun, or really kind of exciting to have these smart people really trying to understand and get to the bottom of what we were trying to do. So of course, you don't get, as we heard in the first hour, you don't see the referee reports until the whole process is concluded, until after the interview, after you get the decision. But in hindsight, all the questions asked to us by the panel were based on the comments from the referees. And I think again, and one thing that's again worth noting, perhaps the final thing to note, is that the interview was very, very much solely concerned with scientific excellence. Of course, again, that's the stated criteria, but there is some question. I'm saying that also to say there's some questions in the chat about like whether other factors are important. At least to us, it appeared that they really only cared about the science. And so I think it's worth highlighting because so at least my experience of EPSRC, so Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council interviews for sort of fellowships or program grants and things, they sort of separate out. They say, okay, the peer review is about the science and the interview is going to be about other criteria. Here, as stated, the interview really was all about scientific excellence. Right, that's actually all I had to say. Again, I didn't want to sort of string it out unnecessarily, but I'm happy to stick around and answer questions however you want to do it.
Super. Thank you so much. So interesting. We've got just over half an hour now to take some questions, but I'd like to ask, by asking you, Professor Spence, can you give us a sense of the team composition of the other people involved? How many people were overall involved in the project?
So we worked it out, and we had in total we had just under 50 person years of time on the project. And so I should say, of course, so again, we were sort of mathematicians, scientific computing. We had money for computer equipment, but by far the main sort of resource was time of people.
Yeah. Thank you. I was very curious for a project of this type. Let's say, you don't. Yeah, very interesting. So Georgina, we're happy to take some questions.
Excellent. So how this bit is going to work, myself and a couple of other colleagues from the UKRO team, so we've got Raquel and Laura still with us, so we are each going to take it in turns, asking you two questions. We'll try to address the most pertinent ones, so i.e. those that have been upvoted the most or have the most thumbs up. We have also been writing some responses throughout, but we still will allude to a few of those questions because they've been some popular themes, as you've already noticed. So I'm going to start by asking the most upvoted question from Kate Cowton. What level of detail would you advise on the methodology / approach in the B1? E.g., would you talk about your work packages?
I think I'm going to take that. Go, Euan, yeah.
So I should say we did talk about our work packages in B1. Of course, there were the 5 pages. It's very tight. It's difficult to get everything in, but we did talk about the specific work packages in B1.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Of course, we're entering into uncharted territory because the ERC has changed now the way they want to see the proposal structure. So, but part 1 in part in part B1 is still 5 pages. So I think it would be wise to give just an outline of high-level view of your work packages, of your proposal strategy, but do not go overboard with that because then you have more space now in part B2 because you don't have to state again, contextualize again in the state of the art. So do focus on the implementation specifically in part B2, while you give just a light touch on the methodology in part 1.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask the question. So we've had quite a few questions around PIs within and outside member and associated member states. So the first question is, Synergy PIs, do they need to be in different countries? And another common question we've had is, does a third party PI outside an associated or member state country have to spend 50% of their time in a member state or associated member state country?
I'll take that. So PI can be as close as being the same corridor, the same department, so long as they can evidence excellence and also the synergistic aspect of which is expected from the Synergy Grant, but also they can be in different countries. But those geographical location, say, factor is not an eligibility, is not evaluated as such, okay? And the maximum one PI can be based outside European member states and associated countries to Horizon Europe. So the 50% does not apply to that one who is already outside the EU member states or associated countries. Does that answer the question?
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for both presentations. Just that there were loads of questions about co-investigators and what does that mean in terms of ERC terms. Could you sort of maybe expand a little bit of how to include if co-investigators are allowed and how to include them into their proposal?
Maybe I'll start and then I'll ask from the lived experience of Professor Spence. So in DRC, in terms of terminology, yeah, DRC defines any person working on the project who is not the PI as a team member. So that's the way you should refer to people contributing intellectually to your proposal. So the only investigators as such that are the principal investigators. So essentially there are two types of people: PIs and team members. So it's not like a collaborative call in a cluster in Pillar 2. It's more the PI, in this particular case, a set of PIs, and then team members working under the direct supervision of PIs. And those team members can be based anywhere in the world. Don't know, Professor Spence, whether you want to add something in light of your experience? It's a matter of terminology, I think.
Yeah, I have nothing particular to add here.
I think there was a lot of confusion between co-investigators for UKRI terms in comparison to team members for ERC terms. So just to clarify that. Thank you both.
Okay, so a recent question come in from Peter Oakley. I think this is one for you, Professor Spence. Which aspect of your preparation do you feel was the most valuable for the interview?
So we had, obviously the three PIs, we did lots of practice ourselves. We basically wrote down every single question we think we could be answered and work out who was going to answer it. Because of course, not, the dynamics are such that you're all at the front there and you've got to sort of know in advance or sort of work out who's going to answer the question. So we did this basically by preparing everything we could. And then, of course, we had 3 mock interviews that were very helpful. Although, again, the best mock, to emphasize, the best sort of people to have on the mock interviews were, again, smart people from related or other disciplines, just really trying to grill you on the science. So I know we were lucky actually to have these people who got this ERC grant a few years before us, who we talked to. We had one of them on our panel, and this person really kind of was great in preparing us because they really just grilled us as much as they could on the scientific excellence aspect.
Amazing, thank you. We've had a couple of questions around the B1 and B2. I think to summarise, it's sort of the main questions. So here's a question we've received: a follow-up question about the contents of the Part 1 and Part 2 documents. You mentioned that Part 1, how the PIs complement and synergise. Part 2 should discuss the collaborative arrangements. Could you please elaborate further on what you would like to see in these 2 parts in regards to the PIs and the team?
Right. It's fair to say that it's not easy for us, we're not reviewers. So maybe Professor Spence, again, first-hand experience could be more useful there.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, so we were in a different situation where we had the 5-page Part 1 and the 15-page Part 2, but certainly we didn't talk about, again, all the arrangements, how things were going to work, this was all in the part B2. And I think, yeah, so I've sort of forgotten sort of what the question was, apart from where do you stick the collaborative arrangements bit?
Yeah, pretty much, I think. Yeah, I will emphasize that, again, like in methodology, you probably give a light touch in part 1.
Yeah, sorry, I'm jumping in here, but I think the fact that B2 has gone from 15 to 10 pages, in some sense, that makes it a bit easier because you've got less freedom of what somehow these questions about, oh, what should I put in B1, what should I put in B2? Now we've got less freedom, so everything's got to go somewhere. You just got to so now there's no question about whether you should be sort of repeating stuff from in B2 that was in B1 because you haven't got the space, I think.
That's right. So the overall emphasis of part 2 now in B2 is on implementation, whereas feasibility is no longer required in part 1. So you don't need really to justify your claims to an extent in part 1. You just need to enthuse your reviewers with blood and mind really with your groundbreaking idea in part 1. Of course, there are people who understand about feasibility, but then you give a lot more detail with your methodology, your objectives in part B2, and your team arrangements. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There were loads of questions as well about the additional funding. So when can you request additional funding? And there was, I think, a bit of confusion between the 2 million and 4 million that it relates to the ERC Synergy Grant. So could you expand on this a little bit, please?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd be curious to see whether Professor Spence, did you apply for additional funding?
No, we didn't know.
Okay, because not everybody apply for it. So something to say about additional funding. They are restricted to those 4 sort of cases. Yeah, startup costs, access to large facilities. Sorry, let me bring them up again. I should know by heart, but I always get confused there. Startup costs, that means coming to effectively to work either in a EU member state or as a country, purchase of major equipment, but again, that can be slightly deceiving because you can hardly buy an equipment just in the ERC. What you can charge on the ground is only the depreciation cost, like for everything else in Europe, access to large facilities, other major experimental and fieldwork costs. Now, those costs, if you make a case, they would be particularly scrutinized by reviewers, and they will grant that additional money in view of the overall project. Now, something to bear in mind is that if you're granted extra top-up money for these 4 purposes, you cannot relocate them afterwards. So they need to be used specifically for the purpose they were granted for. Yeah. So that because otherwise in the core or in the base amount, you have a level of flexibility among budget categories, but that does not apply to additional funding. So once you've made a case and you were evaluated for those particular 4 categories, and on those 4 categories in additional funding, then money needs specifically to be spent on that. It cannot be relocated otherwise. Now, the novelty is that now you can include personal costs. So if you got people working at that facility, or you need a technician to run a particular piece of equipment because you have access to a large facility or some major experimental work, you need people on the ground, you can now include personal costs in that. About the 1 million and the 2 million. So each PI can claim up to 1 million if they are already based within the EU member state or associate country. But if they come from outside, they can claim up to 2 million each if they come to European member state or associate country. Hope that makes sense.
Okay. So the next question from Lorna Fox O'Mahony. The default seems to be putting together a consortium of 4 PIs. So, but what if the project can be best achieved under 2 PIs? Is this seen as a disadvantage for this scheme? Is the 4 PIs a standard expectation? And do you know whether any or many awards have been made to 2 PI-led projects?
I can take that to start with, and then Professor Spence, please feel free to jump in. So the best thing to do in that case is to go on the ERC website and see the ERC dashboards on what has been funded under the ERC. Now, there are projects with 2 PIs, but as you can see, you won't find many. Okay, so it is possible if you make a strong case for it, but the majority of people will be around 3 PIs or 4 PIs. But it's technically possible, so you shouldn't be put off by the fact you only 2 if you think you're articulate and persuasive enough to have a team of just 2 team members. By extension, that applies also to the duration of the project. The ERC is 6 years. It doesn't mean you have to do 6 years necessarily. You can ask for less resources in terms of time. Again, see the historic data as well. Once I went to check which was the shortest possible funded by the ERC, I think there is something like, shorter than 2 years, perhaps you start already getting into a territory that is no longer complying with the ERC. But it's me talking. I think the best is to check historic data on what has been funded, but 2 should be enough, is enough.
Thank you. We've had a question in regards to the, questions are coming through. In regards to the funding cap. So within the 10 million, is there still a funding cap for each PI institution, or has that been abolished?
Not that I know, it's not written anywhere. So I think the unspoken sort of rule, so far as I can understand it, the 10 million overall. Yeah. So it's not 2.5 million per PI. So it's 10 million as a cumulative cap.
Thank you very much. There was a question about scientific advisory group. I don't know if you had one in your proposal, Professor Spencer, but how do evaluators view having a scientific advisory group as part of the proposal? Is it seen as a benefit or as a weakness? So is it seen as a less ownership of their PI or not necessarily?
I can say, so we didn't say we were going to have a scientific advisory group, and we don't. We didn't get any questions about this at the interview, and none of the referees asked about this. Of course, this is just in our context, but that's an example where no one seemed to mind.
Yeah,
okay.
I've seen the ERC replying to that saying, if you got 1, that's fine, but it's not an evaluation criteria. Of course, it sort of, in a way, helps reassuring the reviewers that that the process is sound and all that, but is not assessed as evaluation if you got an advisory board or not.
Okay, next question from Janet Body. It's a follow-up question on the team members, the team composition. Is it fine to have team members with significant specific expertise that they end up being stronger than the PIs?
I wonder whether, Professor Spence, you have how you calibrated your team members on that. And then I think
yeah. So this is a good question. In fact, in one of the 3 institutions, we had a team member who was more senior than the PI at that institution. And again, this is something, in the preparation for the interview, and again, people were sort of telling us to be prepared and to be sort of ready to really demonstrate the PI was still the leader, because again, you read in the documentation, and then we saw in the first hour how the instructions are the PI really has to be the leader, and so we did. Yeah, so we had a team member who was more senior than the PI. Again, we were ready for questioning on this. I don't think we got really any questioning on this, but we were certainly very conscious to emphasize and to give evidence that the PI in that institution was leading it, and this team member was providing specific expertise, but was not going to take over and actually be the true leader?
Perfect. Yeah, just to reemphasize what Professor Spence said, the standard answer is yes. Team members can be even more senior than the PI, and that applies across all the other frontier grants as well, not just Synergy. But yes, I mean, the drawback there, or something to be cautious about, is that you should really evidence that you are leading the project. Sometimes there are PIs who use where become team members and they use a proxy, PI just because they are not eligible, because they, so it should really be clear that the PI is leading the project and team members are under the direct supervision, though might be more senior of the PI.
Thank you. Another question we've received is it expected that all PIs attend the interview? What happens if we have other commitments during that week?
So there's some text.
Yeah,
there's some. Sorry, I'm interrupting, Antonio,
yeah, no.
But there's some text sort of saying about, if you really can't make it, you can perhaps be there virtually. I think. I guess again, of course, it's easy to say, but my experience would be cancel whatever else you've got and go to the interview if you're lucky enough to get to the interview.
So totally agree. I mean, there is something in the information for applicants that basically says you should really go, unless you've got very serious sort of issues. But please do not just reply, I'm going to a conference or I'm on holiday. I mean, that wouldn't be considered a sufficient reason. It must be something really compelling, because again, just to emphasize that teamwork among the four is an evaluation criteria. So it's really important that you show also not only with the science, but also with the body language, with the way you interact, that you have a well-oiled machine ready to carry out the project, to the extent that, as I mentioned, if one of those PIs throughout the lifespan of the project is no longer available for any reason, the project collapses. So it's very important that you make it in person and you show that you can work together as a team.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Raquel, and just to say that in order to facilitate that process, DRC already says, has indicated what the dates for the interview are. So if you're already planning to apply, already I think it's from the 7th to the 11th of September. So it's not even be taken by surprise by the day of the interview.
Yeah, that's correct. From the 7th to the 11th of September 2026. So those days to bear in mind. The next question is about the location of the PIs. So with the fact that all PIs are in the same university organization work against the project in any way, so having 2 to 4 PIs based at the same institution, would that work against in any way?
No, it won't. And again, if you want hard data, you can go to the ERC dashboard. You can see also by host institution. But the bottom line there is you need to evidence excellence and the synergistic effects of the 4 team members. But then they can be based, literally one next to the other in the same university. But they need to have that interdisciplinarity and that synergistic element in the proposal.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so the next question is on inclusion of further overseas PIs. So a question from Fang Liu. I intended to invite a collaborator based in Hong Kong to be a PI, but their institutional policy prohibits them from working 30% on the grant. Now I'm considering including them as a team member, but they will have to hire some PDRAs or PhD student at their institution to carry out the work under their supervision. Is that okay?
Now, my instinctive reaction to that is that that individual that you would have included as PI in Hong Kong can now become your team member. So you don't have to invent another position, and that would be supervised by your who was initially designed to be a PI. So that initial individual can become your team member, because there is no level of seniority sort of expectation for team members, if I understand the question correctly.
I think the question is more around the costing of positions when you've only added somebody as a team member as opposed to a sort of bona fide PI. So what are the costs that can be incurred at team member sites?
The costs are defined by the PI, but they need to make sense in light of the usual accounting practice of the host institution. So yeah, basically they can be pitched at any level. You can have a postdoc as a team member, but you can have a full professor in theory as a team member, if being a PI it has some constraints. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions here for Euan. What are the key tips that you would give when preparing an application, i.e. drafting the proposal, working with the other PIs, preparing the budget and completing the application form? And is there anything you would do differently in applying again?
So I think in the drafting the proposal, it was of course useful to get people from other sort of related disciplines to read it, right? So our proposal, we knew it was going to be in computational maths, but we knew we'd be in a panel. Again, it was split into these 5 panels, but we knew our panel would be physical sciences and engineering. So we got physicists to read it, we got engineers to read it. I think, of course, this was So this was I think helpful just to try and get past, because the first stage, is assessed by the panel. You need to sort of convince them you're doing something sensible. Preparing the budget, I found the budget to be okay. The budget was, again, so for like a UKRI grant, you really got to have the budget really like nailed down in the form, sort of really kind of done everything beforehand. Whereas, okay, so for here, you do the budget beforehand, but there's still some sort of you then, if the grant's awarded, you then submit it, and there's some wiggle room that things can be changed if circumstances have changed since the grant since you wrote the grant. So I mentioned that just because for me the main work with the budget was actually after we figured out we got it, and the beforehand it wasn't. That wasn't the most of the work. Completing the application form. I mean, of course, there's a classic thing. Just start early. Start early and get registered in the system. Don't leave it to the last minute. I think the system is pretty good and quite user. It doesn't take very long to get used to it. But but doing it the day of the application deadline is not a good strategy. And sorry, just finally, is there anything I would do differently again? I can't think of anything particularly. Sorry, that's the honest answer, but yeah.
Thank you, Professor Spence. I'm glad someone is finding the funding attendance portal user-friendly. Good to hear.
The next question is about the portability of the grant. So the question is, from the slide, it seemed that the PI must remain within the same host institution for the duration of the project. Is that correct? Or can the PI move the grants with them and take it to another institution?
Yeah. Yes. So sorry if it wasn't clear. So the PI, yes, has the right of portability, which means they can change host institution during the lifetime of the project, so long as the new host institution is still a legal entity based in either a member state or sister country of Horizon Europe, exception made for that one PI who is already based outside the European Union or member state associated to or sister country to Horizon Europe. That individual can go anywhere else in the world or come to Europe as well. So that's also an option.
Okay, right, we're in the last 5 minutes, so we'll endeavour to ask at least one question each. The next one is around the sort of type of research and the approach, hypothesis generating versus hypothesis testing. If your project is regarding developing new instrumentation to enable groundbreaking science in the future, how should this be pitched versus purely science proposals where the output is the science directly?
I'll try to answer that. So the ERC prides itself of not distinguishing between, applied or theoretical research. So again, the ERC dashboard is a good place to, in a way, to pitch yourself against what has been, to benchmark yourself against what has been funded. So do not be put off by, let's say, being a more theoretical or more applied science, so long as the key concept there is that you must evidence that you're doing something groundbreaking, new, not incremental research, and is excellent in nature. Other than that, the content of what you do is rather secondary. Would you agree, Professor Spence?
Yes, yeah, yeah. I think as long as you can, again, as long as you can get people excited from a scientific excellence point of view, anything goes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've had a question in regards to the interview panels. How international are the panels? Do they include people from beyond EU member or associated countries? I'm thinking of Global South countries, for example, for regional expertise.
Very interesting question. Yes, I mean, the ERC cherry picks themselves, the evaluators. So it's not like with other proposals in which evaluators can come forward and register on the funding and tender portal. So they are cherry picked, if you want, on the sole basis of being top experts in that particular area of expertise. Now, I don't have on hand any demographics, though, to support my statement. From 2025, the work program DRC has made available now the names of reviewers afterwards. So one could go and check, really, in terms of representation of different geographical areas. But yes, they really source the best of the best around the world to evaluate your proposal.
Thank you very much. The next question is about the time commitment that the PIs dedicate to the project. So does the funder take a view on how the time commitments should break down between PIs and team members? Are the PIs ever or often dedicated 100% of their time to the Synergy Grant? What was the distribution in your project, Professor Spencer? Was there anyone dedicating 100% of their time to the Synergy Grant?
Yeah, so I'm dedicated 80% of the time, and one of the other PIs also 80%, and then of course there's some team members. So postdocs are obviously 100% of the time. Yeah, but for us there was a mixture of time commitments.
And also for people to be aware, the minimum time commitment to the grant, which is 30% in Synergy, applies only to PIs, not to team members. Yeah, so you can cost, postdocs or PhDs part-time course. That's absolutely acceptable, so long as the PIs have that minimum 30%, which is the bare minimum. Please remember that that minimum time commitment must fit or make sense in light of what you propose to implement. Some people, propose, like a very complex and articulated proposal with a not very credible time commitment sometimes, and that is an evaluation criteria to be taken into account as well.
Okay.
Right. What do you think?
So one last question.
Okay.
So because we've had a few different questions around seniority. So I'm going to try and amalgamate a couple of them. So what, for those applicants applicants that might not have a very, very strong track record in winning funding, what might your advice be? And if there are indeed a group of less senior PIs that then are costing in things like training, how would that be seen?
Perhaps I can start to answer. So, and in fact, I was actually just about to type in an answer to that on the chat. This question about the PI grant winning history. I guess my impression is that it's mainly relevant only so much as track record, as in have you got the scientific track record to be a PI for this scale of grant. I guess if a PI hadn't had any grants at all and hadn't managed people before, then you can imagine there'd be some questions about have they got their expertise to do the managing. But I didn't get the impression that it was sort of, if you haven't had big grants before, you're immediately sort of not considered. Over to you, Antonino.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, scientific excellence is key. Training, like medical curiosity action, is not an explicit aspect, if you want, of the ERC. So if you're confident that your track records meets the requirements that is expected for the ERC, and you haven't had big grants in the past, go for it. And just be aware that there is anecdotal evidence that the majority of ERC grants are resubmission, so you might not get through the first time around. But if you are mindful of the resubmission restrictions, you might really treasure those feedback and prepare a better, stronger proposal for next time around.
Okay, over to you to wrap up.
So yes, well, thank you everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Euan Spence, for your valuable time. It's been incredible to have you on the board today, and thank you very much, my colleagues, for supporting with the Q&A session, and all of you for your attendance. Laura and I remain available on the ERC dedicated inbox, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.